In the 8 weeks or so before the Olympic flame was lit in Paris, the people of France voted 3 times. First, in the European Parliament election, in which the French delivered something of a kicking to the centrist ensemble coalition associated with President Emmanuel Macron, and delivered a thumping endorsement of the National Rally, the far-right party of serial presidential candidate Marine Le Pen. Second and third in 2 rounds of a surprise early parliamentary election called by President Macron from this apparently disadvantaged position. Much analysis of the decision depicted Macron as akin to a busted gambler slapping his watch on the blackjack table and hoping his luck would change. Which it did. Well, sort of. The first round of the election went as might have been predicted, i.e. very well for the National Rally, pretty badly for Macron's bunch. But in the second round, France's left-wing and centrist tendencies regrouped. As of this broadcast, it is not certain who will be France's next Prime Minister, but it is possible that Macron's allies will still play some role in governing France. France's Olympic fortnight has been embraced by many as a blessed sanctuary from the rancour and intrigue of French politics. But politics will have to resume shortly, and many outside France will be watching, wondering if France has somehow saved itself from the far right. Is it possible that this successful Olympics might cause the French to embrace their president's optimism? Has Macron actually alchemized an antidote to angry populism? And if he has, can anybody else learn the recipe? This is the Foreign Desk.
We really need to connect it, the society problematics, and having a humanist approach, because it's a duty from the IOC and the organizers, and I think it was part of the bid of Paris 2024, and it's part of the French values also.
The word you use for Macron is hubris. Perhaps he thinks that after the Olympics and the fact that it's a great popular thing in Paris, we have to think about the fact that in France, what we understand since the election, there is Paris and France.
A lot of French people enjoy the posture of protest, enjoy supporting the far left, the far right, when there's no chance of them getting power. And then last month, the strange thing was that for the first time, they might actually get power, the far right. And I think many voters thought, I don't really want that. I want someone like Macron to run the country, and then I can shout at him.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. Monocle Radio has been broadcasting from Paris throughout the Olympic fortnight, meeting athletes, journalists, analysts, artists and business folk at our pop-up studio overlooking the city. In this episode, we'll hear first of all from Christophe Dubi, Executive Director of the Olympic Games for the International Olympic Committee. Christophe stopped by our special Olympic show, Monocle in Paris. He spoke to Monocle's Emma Nelson about the level of support for the Games among Parisians and what set these Olympics apart from those of other nations.
I'm stunned about the behavior of the Parisians and the acceptance for games which are very disturbant, especially to the center of Paris, right? We had all the security measures prior to the opening ceremony and all these road closures throughout the day. I think one of the explanations why we have the support is that for many Parisians, the game started earlier and delivered goods, especially in Seine-Saint-Denis, but in the schools as well, in the sports club, right before the Games, or I would say even a few years prior to the Games. Before we're speaking about the legacy of the Games, which is always the after 17 days. There they anticipated and delivered some of the programs prior to the Games. And I think it really helped in the acceptance of all these measures that are constraints. But in the end, again, from businesses to citizens, they all came together.
Tell me how you reconfigured the approach to hosting a Games when you started to work with Paris, insofar as you've spoken in the past about how the way that the Olympics need to approach their role is that they must no longer make a city work with them. The Olympics must now work within a city. Tell me how you came to that conclusion and how that has borne out here in Paris.
Many examples in the past. The development in Hellenico Airport in Athens. We still have scars from what happened there. Developments of venues which are never used for the sole purpose of the games. Bobsleigh track in Torino, not used. We can't have that anymore. The games have to adapt to a city and a region, not the reverse. And this is what you see here in Paris. Yes, they have built 2 venues because they're needed for the community long term. One is a multi-purpose hall, basketball mainly, and the second is a swimming pool, both, by the way, in Seine-Saint-Denis. And the villages in Seine-Saint-Denis as well, for the media and for the athletes. Why? Because this is a disfranchised community that need those venues. We could have built a temporary venue. We did it in London for basketball. You remember in the park? There we decided to go to Lille. And it makes sense to go to Lille because we had a fabulous venue there, right? Is it longer to go to Lille than something temporarily built in Paris? Yes. Does it change the experience starting from the athletes and for all of those than being in the venues or watching on TV? Absolutely not. Okay, and this is what we have done. In addition to simplifying all requirements. We don't need to have 3-stars restaurants across the Olympic Theatre. We can go with a sandwich and a salad when it makes sense. The Champ de Mars, for example, where you have an offer next door to your hotel in Bercy, well, you have kitchen. Then you can have more elaborate menus. So this is the kind of things where we say, let's be as simple as we can. The games are complicated enough in their essence to simplify everything else that can be simplified. So Paris is a beautiful demonstration of how it can work.
Tell me one last question. It's probably an unfair one. If there is one thing that you will take away from Paris, even if it's the slightest, tiniest moment.
I went with my colleague Anouk to Seine-Saint-Denis 2 weeks prior to the Games, going to school. And they had prepared their Olympic song. And right, it's school kids, their age probably 5 to 10. You know what? I was crying. I was like, okay, that does it for me. When the games mean that these communities there, they are singing and the text is absolutely fantastic. It's so simple, so basic, so human that you feel you have left something in that community in Paris. 2 weeks prior, I take it any day.
That was Christophe Dubi, Executive Director of the Olympic Games for the International Olympic Committee. You can hear the full interview by checking out the Monocle in Paris show on our website. But for more on France's view of these Olympic Games, I was joined by Laurence Fischer, French Ambassador of Sport in the run-up to the Paris Games, also a former karate world champion and currently founder of the NGO Fight for Dignity. I began by asking her for her personal view on why it had been important for Paris to host the Olympics again.
Good question. Because as you know, we try 2 times before to host them, and because we ever did it 100 years before, and it was amazing. And also, we know how to celebrate sport in France, and we have the culture of hosting big sport event. And it was very important for us to welcome again the Olympic Games and Paralympic. It was new.
Was it difficult, though, convincing the French in general and Parisians in particular this was all going to be worth the trouble? I mean, as we speak, there does seem to be general agreement that these games have been a tremendous success. But obviously, for months and years building up to them, the French in general and Parisians in particular were going, no, this will be dreadful, it'll be an expensive shambles and everybody will laugh at us. How did you overcome those objections?
If you remember, in 2012, we were very motivated. And before 2008 also, and in 2008 in Lille, the citizens and the French people said, hey, no, we don't want. And so we said, okay, let's work on the reasons why and how we can manage and how we can convince them. And I think it was a great lesson. And this is why we were really ready to involve French people in this bid. And also we have huge arguments. For example, 92% of the infrastructures are existing. So we didn't need to build a white elephant. And also the village, athlete village, and what we built is really useful for the population. And doing all the event around the Stade de France, Saint-Denis it's a poor part of France, north of Paris. So this is also how we try to convince the French people, and especially around Paris, that it was good for them. And also, people, for example, they say, well, yeah, the Olympic Games is only in Paris, and we live in Bordeaux, in Toulouse. We will not be part of the party. And we did something really, really important. It's the Terre de Jeux. Paris 2024 went everywhere in France. Say the Games is for everyone. It's not only for Paris and Saint-Denis.
Was there a lot of conversation within the organisation of the Games, though, about what kind of image you wanted these Games to present of Paris and of France? Because obviously, though Paris and France have hosted the Games before, that was a long time ago, and France was a very, very different country. Were there particular discussions about this is what we want people to go away from these Games thinking of us?
Yeah, I think for the opening ceremony was really what we want to share. The attractivity of France, people come in France. The attractivity is okay. But the amazing thing that we work on is how you can match what people know, Tour Eiffel, Château de Versailles. I think it was a great réussite because we arrived to match those places that everyone who likes France knows, and we match it with sport. And sometimes the people who say, oh yes, France, you don't need the Paralympic Games because, yes, but who? Tell me, who today? Make these places really connected with sport. So when you come and you are fond of sport or not, and you say, hey, I want to see équitation, or yesterday I went to la Place de la Concorde, urban disciplines, say, wow.
It is a theme of your own work that sport can be about much more than sport. This is the reason for the work you've done with various NGOs. Were you kind of hoping as well that we would see examples at these Games of sport as empowerment of people?
We don't have choice. The way we treat the humanity, but our earth, and I think it's an emergency. I hope that will not be any more NGOs, but the state will use support what we do. I said we because, of course, Fight for Dignity, we are involved in the kind of problematic of our humanity. I don't know, maybe it's not enough focus, but we really need to connect it, the society problematics, and having a humanist approach, because it's a duty from the IOC and the organizers, and I think it was part of the bid of Paris 2024, and it's part of the French values also.
I do just want to ask you one more question
Come on.
about your own sport, at which you were a
karate.
triple world champion.
Yes.
It was obviously in Tokyo as an optional sport. It's not in Paris. Do you hope that it will become a permanent Olympic sport?
When you're an athlete, when your sport is your life and you're involved, of course, Olympic Games or Paralympic Games, it's the Graal. In a career, it's you're just dreaming of that. Of course, I want to. But there's many sports who wants to be part. Squash will be, for example, in LA. Paris, for example, had 3 pillars: urban, youth, and innovative games. You have to answer when you're a discipline. So the International Federation need to adapt to find something new. Karate, there's other 5 fighting disciplines. So you lose a fight because we are not in Paris. We will be not in Los Angeles. Maybe in Brisbane, but you have to defend to convince. It's terrible. For example, Stephen Da Costa was part of the 10 gold medal in karate, French medals, and it's terrible. But it's part of the game.
That was Laurence Fischer, former French ambassador of sport and triple karate world champion. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. President Emmanuel Macron has not been entirely absent from the Paris Games, but he has not been as present as might have been expected, especially at a moment of such national triumph. He is presumably spending at least some of the Olympic break figuring out who is going to run the country from here on. Well, earlier I spoke with Marie-Pierre Lannelongue, editor-in-chief of M, Le Monde's Friday magazine. I began by asking whether the Olympic period has felt like a holiday for France from France's politics.
It was. In French, we say a parenthèse enchantée that I couldn't translate, but it was a holy bubble or magical bubble, and definitely holidays. That's right. But the holidays will be finished on Sunday, and on Monday, I think President Macron will have a meeting with the former government. And we'll see, and I suppose probably in 1 week, the atmosphere will be completely different.
Are you expecting things just to go back to business as usual, that French politics will once again be all uproar and rancour and just general brouhaha? Do you think anything about the last 2 weeks might have had a lasting effect?
I fear not. I'm really pessimistic because we have serious problem. I mean, we don't have a government. We are used to have two big parties, and now we have three. And one of the three is a very extreme right party, racist in a way, homophobic. You know, it's a serious problem. And more or less 50% at one point of France, they voted for them. In some places out of Paris, far from the Olympics, far from this bubble. Paris has always been a bubble in France. In Paris, we are used to a multicultural atmosphere. It's a multicultural city. People come from all over the world. The diversity is not really a problem, and it's a good thing. And that's what we see with especially with the athletes. So the Olympics embodies this idea of a modern France. But most of the French citizens, they voted against this idea of France. And once again, you talk about business as usual. Actually, it was unusual. What we experienced since the day President Macron decided out of the blue, we haven't still exactly understood what he had in mind. And now we have to deal with something totally new, no majority, and they are unable to speak each other and to have a government like it's the case in Germany or in Italy sometimes. But we are not used to that. And at the moment, I can't see those three blocks working together. And the situation is, so difficult because we voted 3 times like in less than 1 month. And each time the result was different. The message was different in a way. I mean, the President Macron, he said before the dissolution, I want the situation to be clear. But it's not clear at all,
But one thing that is clear is that Macron's own party was rejected fairly firmly at the European elections and then at the snap parliamentary election that he called. It has become conventional wisdom that the French elect a president grudgingly and then just sort of resent and dislike them more and more the longer they govern. But in Macron's particular case, what is it about him and what he stands for that was being rejected when so many French people rejected it?
I think this is a huge mystery. With Macron, and especially in the last period, it's not about politics, it's not about strategy, it's not about ideas, it's about psychology. What does he has in mind? And the word you use for Macron is hubris. The idea that he's alone, he thinks everything is all right, and he doesn't have a lot of people around him, just a little bunch of counselors, men, almost no woman except his wife. Perhaps he thinks that after the Olympics and the fact that, of course, it's a great popular thing in Paris, we have to think about the fact that in France, what we understand since the election, there is Paris and France.
There's a dynamic there, just finally, that I think we've seen in a few places around the world that have struggled with some kind of populism. The big cities tend to be, as you were saying, fairly liberal and multicultural in their outlook, and those big cities exist in their little bubble and tend to forget that a lot of the rest of the country doesn't feel the same way. Are you worried, and do you think people in Paris are worried that Macron's manoeuvring may not have stopped the progress of National Rally towards forming a government, perhaps even acquiring the presidency, but may just have postponed it? Do you think there is a common fear in Paris that this is coming 5 or 10 years from now, that National Rally will be the government and that Marine Le Pen may even be the president?
Each time we can stop the wave, we all have the impression that it's just for this year or 2 years. Also, we experiment such a popular, movement 25 years ago with the Coupe du Monde de football that we won with this Black Blamber team, which was really the diversity of France.
This is 1998.
1998. And we experiment that. And okay, we were in the street with this same kind of joys and exactly the same kind of bubble. And 2 years after that, Jean-Marie Le Pen was second during the presidential election, which is the most important election in France. And all the Black Blamber, all the diversity was totally forgotten. And that's the same for England with the Brexit just 4 years after the Olympics. That's why we are pessimistic, especially because we don't have the time.
That was Marie-Pierre Lannelongue, editor-in-chief of Le Monde's Friday magazine M. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller, recorded in Paris, and it is obviously too early to tell how or if the Olympic Games and President Macron's pre-Olympic manoeuvring have actually changed France. But it won't just be the French taking an interest in whether or not this is the case. Well, I'm joined now by Simon Kuper, Financial Times journalist and author recently of Impossible City, a book on the Paris of today. Simon, do you think, first of all, as President Macron contemplates going back to politics as usual, he will have been pleasantly surprised by how his election gamble turned out?
Are we talking about the election gamble or the Olympic gamble?
Either or both, or the pre-Olympic election gamble.
The election gamble to call legislative elections when it wasn't necessary turned out better, not as badly as many people had predicted. So his party wasn't wiped out. The far right didn't win a parliamentary majority. He couldn't exactly say, look, I'm a genius, ha-ha, because his party had lost massive amounts of seats. But then the Olympic gamble has turned out brilliantly in that people said, he invited the foreign journalists to drinks at the Élysée a few days before the game started. And he spoke to us in English, and he said, people say having an opening ceremony on the Seine is a crazy idea. And I must admit, I thought then, yeah, it is a crazy idea. It's a massive terrorist target. But it worked out beautifully, having events at venues all through Paris in front of the Eiffel Tower at Concorde. Worked out beautifully, brilliantly. He would say it wasn't a gamble. I knew beforehand it would be great. And, there's massive approval from the French of how things are going. I've never seen the French massively approve of anything in the 20 years I've lived here.
But as a consequence of their approval of the Olympics, are they likely to disapprove of President Macron any less than they did a fortnight ago?
There might be a tiny Olympic afterglow. The Olympics isn't just a kind of nationalist crescendo. It is a massive organisational feat, which so far the government has perfectly cleared, 9.8. And so you have to give the government some credit. There was this amazing moment when he appeared in the Stade de France, the Olympic Stadium, a few days ago, when a section of the crowd began chanting Macron Président. It must be the first time he hasn't been abused in public in 6 years. So I think there might be a tiny bit of afterglow.
Do you think the Olympics are shaping up to be remembered as a significant part of his legacy, though? Is this something people will think of 10 years from now when they think of President Macron?
I think so, because it wasn't just that France staged the games and they went well, because, you know, France has hosted many sports events before, most recently last year's Rugby World Cup. They know how to do this. It's not really a surprise. But it didn't just go off well. It also was a beautiful event, like no previous Olympics, in that it was held in front of some of the most beautiful urban scenery in the world. That was a massive gamble. That's unique. I was interviewing the mayor of Istanbul a couple of days ago, and he said, yeah, I'd never seen that before. Maybe we can do that in Istanbul for the European Games, have events in front of the Sultan Ahmeds and the Hagia Sophia and so on. So I think it's given a whole new idea of what a sports event can be. I think definitely in 50 years, sort of pictures from the Olympics will remain in the French collective photograph album, and it will be a happy moment, thanks partly to Macron.
Because there is a conventional wisdom that exists among centrists, and I guess we can characterise President Macron as such, that the antidote to populism is competence. You get into power and you demonstrate to people that you can actually govern and that this is how things do actually work. Do you think that these games are going to work for Macron in that respect?
I don't think that the chief critique of Macron in the past was failure and that nothing worked anymore. Sometimes people would shout that, but, you know, the economy has done fairly well. Unemployment has dropped massively in his tenure. I think the emotional basis for the critique, which is sort of correct emotionally, is his arrogance and his aloofness, which won't necessarily go away. I mean, if it was strictly about competence, then, you know, obviously there's a lot to criticize, but you'd have to say the Macron years have not been bad. It's been all right.
But looking ahead, though, how confident should he, or indeed anyone, be that he has forestalled, outmanoeuvred, headed off the national rally?
I think it was interesting that polls were predicting that the national rally, the far right, might get a majority in the parliamentary elections a month ago. And in fact, they fell massively short. They got about a third of the vote. And I think that says to me that a lot of French people enjoy the posture of protest, enjoy supporting the far left, the far right, when there's no chance of them getting power, as has always been the case up to now for decades and decades. And then last month, the strange thing was that for the first time, they might actually get power, the far right. And I think many voters thought, oh, I don't really want that. I want someone like Macron to run the country, and then I can shout at him. And so the far right vote massively disappointed. So I'm not sure the far right is as confident now that they will ever get power, whereas in June they would have said, yeah, it's going to happen one day.
Is that something specific, do you think, to French populism? The idea that, you know, that the people who follow it do basically want the fight rather than the win?
I think that is a particularly French thing, because there's no Western country, I think, that valorizes the idea of revolution and rebellion so much. So if you think of the main things that people are taught at school, the glorious moments, it's 1789, you cut off the king's head, and then 1944, you rebel against the hated German regime. And so in 1968, the beautiful revolution. So the idea of being against the government is much more valorized in France than it is, say, in the UK, where people grumble but mostly ignore politicians.
Which hasn't been the case, of course, in the last couple of weeks in the UK. Relatively tiny, though, the numbers of people rioting have been. Is there anything, though, that either Sir Keir Starmer or the leader of any other country beset by an amount of populism can import from what Macron has done? Or is it the case that the French situation is just really too French to learn anything from?
I mean, I'm not sure that Macron has been this bulwark against populism, that he has destroyed. He certainly hasn't destroyed the populist enemy. They will have another big run at the presidential election in 2027. I'm not sure there are so many lessons from Macron. There are a couple of moments when he does well. When the Yellow Vest uprising starts in 2018, he's totally taken by surprise. He then does this listening tour around the country. He goes to town halls and libraries and villages and small towns. And for a while, he actually listens to people. That did, I think, make a bit of impression for a short while.
And just finally, in terms of what might be an Olympic legacy, arguments about immigration are at the root of so many modern populist insurgencies, just as was the case when France won the World Cup at home in 1998. The success of the French Olympic team is being held up as an example of what a multicultural France can actually accomplish. Can you see the triumph of France and France have done very, very well at these games, not just in terms of staging them, but competing in them. Does a demonstration of France's multicultural reality and that reality triumphant, does that ever take any of the edge out of the immigration row or not?
I don't think the sporting success helps. I mean, often it just cements the idea that that's the role of black people, the stereotype that black people's realm is sport, but they are not allowed into realms like law and accountancy. I think that one event that was much more significant in terms of accepting French diversity was the opening ceremony. It's now, because people are watching it on repeat, the most watched television program in French history, and it's a hymn to diversity, and particularly that scene of Aya Mueller, the Malian rapper born in grew up in the French suburbs, performing in front of the Académie Française with the Garde Républicaine. You're bringing together traditional France and new France. I think, and that whole video, that whole evening, which starts with Zinedine Zidane and Jamel Debbouze, two Arab origin men, I think that's saying we're diverse, we're good, and 86% of French people approved of that diverse message.
Say an unusual moment of unity, I guess, for France. But just as a final thought, it has been really interesting coming here for a couple of weeks and seeing the French in general and Parisians in particular having to get to grips with the idea that maybe actually their country and its capital are kind of marvellous. Do you see this having any long-term effect on that great French fondness for contriving to find things to dislike and complain about?
I was talking to a Parisian friend about that this morning, and we were saying, in the opening ceremony, but really the rest of the games, you see the rest of the world look at this city and say, wow, there's nothing like it. And it's not just beautiful and old, Rome is beautiful and old, but it's also modern and it works, which Rome isn't. So in that sense, there is no other place like this in the world. And to see the city through foreign eyes has been really salutary. And in France, the Parisians whine about Parisian life, about, the cars and the rain and the people. And the French whine about Paris. So the far right is really an anti-Paris movement. The yellow vests are an anti-Paris movement, this elite city and so on. And I think the games are showing, you know what? Paris is not the problem of France. Paris is this incredible asset that other countries wish they had.
And do you think maybe President Macron is right now wishing he'd called the election for straight after the Olympics rather than just before?
I think to have had it the day after the Olympics would have been smart, but might have had logistical issues.
Simon Kuper, thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk here in Paris on Monocle Radio. That's it for this special episode of The Foreign Desk recorded in Paris. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. Special thanks as well to all our team in Paris, especially Tom Webb and Laura Kramer for their assistance with this episode. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.